I'm calling the Finance Committee meeting to order at 2:35 p.m. on Tuesday, October 22nd. And we have 6 members of the committee present. We're not expecting Sharon Povinelli today, who's one of the resident members, who's a non-voting member of the committee, but we do expect our 5th member from the council. And the chair of the Affordable Housing Trust, which is our major presentation, isn't here yet, so I'm going to give it a couple of minutes before we start that discussion and cover a couple of other topics. One is just an announcement, and that's on what happened last night with the Centennial Water Treatment Plant. I'm not going to go into the detail I went into last night. It was unanimously approved by the council. The discussion was probably more on the aspect that was the last paragraph of our report, where I had raised the question of whether the engineering could look into the possibility of installing solar to do process energy on the site, and recognizing that there's a lot of land possibility there to put in solar and a lot of benefit because the amount of process energy used, and therefore, Ms. Pam has arrived. So, well, 5 members of from the council are present, and everybody who's going to be present from the committee is here. The town manager had indicated to us that he was supportive of going forward and investigating the feasibility of it, but to recognize that we may not be able to get the solar installed at the time that the plant was up, even if we were going to otherwise be able to do it, because we are driven by the timeline of needing to get the plant online before we jeopardize our permit for using the watershed area that works with Centennial. So that was fully understood by the council, and the council was just appreciative of the fact that we were at least looking at the possibility of process energy being included for solar, and we're taking a serious investigation of it, and based on that, went ahead and voted as I reported. So that was one thing. The percent for art bylaw, which we had on the agenda with the, in case there was a possibility that the committee would have done enough framing of what the bylaw envisioned, that we could start thinking about the financial implications. And I think I'll ask Kathy if she wants to just report on what her projection is as to when we might actually be able to take that step. But it's not today.
It's not today. It would be our next meeting, if our next meeting is 2 weeks from now. Because of a posting snafu on my part, we didn't meet today, but we will be meeting next week and begin talking about potential reworking the original document and earmarking the key issues we'll be discussing. So I'll be able to report that back.
So that then covers that article, or that item on the list of topics. I'm going to do one more thing that's on the agenda, and then if Mr. Hornick hasn't arrived, we're going to start talking about the affordable housing priorities policy, because that is the major item for today. It is why we're here.
And I'll mention the capital projects thing.
Hmm?
Well, I should probably talk about the capital projects thing.
Okay. There is not an intention to actually have a substantive discussion about the school budget and assessment methodology today, but I wanted to at least touch base on the fact that it is something that we're going to have to be coming up soon, because I reported at the last meeting about the Four Towns meeting, and at the Four Towns meeting, there is going to be a lot of discussion about what is envisioned for the needs for the schools and where each town is as far as the ability to contribute towards the assessments. And we know that there has been tension over the past several years of dissatisfaction with the assessment method. The one town in particular, Shutesbury, has been pressing for using what's known as the statutory method, which would shift some of the assessment percentage from them in our direction. Since we have a finite amount of money, and what we're going to find out at our four boards meeting is what the staff projection is for the amount of money that's available. We're not in a position to, on a long-term basis, and maybe even on a short-term basis, that's discussions to be had, to increase the amount that we can provide to the regional schools, to support the regional schools. And it creates an incredible bind, which is just a mathematical thing as much as anything. But it is a complex set of laws that has to deal with how the assessment methodology is determined. And Shutesbury does have the ability to force what they're threatening to force, if that's what they say at the meeting, because it's what is assumed to be the method unless all four towns agree on something else. We are not the only region that has this problem. We had information on Martha's Vineyard, of all places, but it actually makes sense there if you know Martha's Vineyard, because Oak Bluff it has relatively less wealth and more students, and they have been on a per pupil basis. And when some of the smaller towns want to move away from the per pupil methodology, so they ended up bringing in a mediator to try and help mediate with the towns on Martha's Vineyard to see if they can find a solution to it. It caught my attention because the mediator is actually somebody I've worked with and know from prior work that I've done in regional school issues. So we do have to be prepared for the four-town meeting, and I think it's up to the council president to make a decision as to whether one person will speak for the town during the meeting and who that might be, but I do think that we need to at least be aware of the issue and see if there's any discussion that we want to have about the issue in advance of the meeting. Lynn?
Are we open for nominations? And I believe we agreed that the Finance Committee would select the person. Is that correct?
I don't know that we've had that discussion.
Or am I supposed to do this through the council?
I think that it is an undecided issue. I don't think we've ever talked about it last year.
Last year it came up so fast.
Last year it came up so fast, and it ended up being me because I was the only one who was on the council who even knew what the issue was.
Right. Are there thoughts across the committee?
When is that Fort-Town meeting?
It is December 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7
7th, yeah.
at the middle school. And it's at 9 o'clock.
And I think that the, yes, go ahead. Don't use your microphone so that just because we're for Amherst Media.
Andy has a lot of background on this, and I think that would be, he would be a good spokesperson. But I also think it's important that the council president, but I think it would be appropriate if both of you got together and spoke. It carries the weight of the council, but I know the depth of knowledge Andy has, and that will be very useful at this meeting.
One of the things we ran into last year is they wanted a smaller group, so they just wanted one representative. I'm of a similar mind to you, whether it's me or just another council person, because I just absolutely sit in wonder when we look at this complicated formula and how it's negotiated every year, sometimes with the hope that it might be for more than 1 year, which we hoped from last year it would be, and we find out maybe it won't be. I'm just very concerned that, there's some deeper understanding across the council, whether that's another councilor or the president of the council. I'm actually neutral on that issue. I just would like to see us have more depth of understanding. Or breadth, I think, is what I want. Depth is here. Breadth is what I want.
It is a difficult issue, and we might want to kind of do a reminder primer, or would that be helpful to sort of do a review of the history and what the legal framework is that we're working in? I was intrigued by what they did on Martha's Vineyard and the idea of some type of mediation. Last time we brought in a consultant to try and help us with the process. It was somebody who had background in the mathematics of it, but was not a mediator. And we did not end up with a reasonable solution out of it last year. The reference was, just so you know, and then I think I'm going to move on to the housing policy, but last year, the superintendent asked that we try it with one person from each town to see if we could come up with a solution that would serve for the, he was hoping for 2 years, and so we did have one person. I ended up being the person from Amherst last year who was in that group. We did come up with a solution that then ultimately sold to the 4 towns, and the 4 towns agreed, but it was very difficult in Shutesbury. There was a lot of pushback, and a lot of people who were threatening to vote no, but then agreed to vote. Enough people agreed to vote yes, with the understanding that it was for 1 year, even though we had talked about 2, that it got us through. So it was a tough year last year.
Andy?
Yes.
Last year, Andy shared in advance to me, because I asked for it, the longer document that talks about the factors that go into the formula, which are, as he's just said, are pretty complex because you actually don't know how each town scores on each factor. I mean, it comes from a, but I think it would be a useful thing just to have us all see that well before December 7th, because I found it conceptually fairly easy to follow why there was tension among the towns when you could see the property values in Amherst compared to the property values in the other towns. So I just think, Lynn, what you're asking is that at least one person in addition to Andy, have some depth in that, and I thought I would go back to it, since last time I read it quickly, knowing that we had someone who really understood it, but that's become one of the issues of understanding that well enough to know when you're, what the key issues are and what you're negotiating on. And I guess the other thing is, will Sean still be here through the December 7th meeting?
Through the December 7th, but not after December 31st, which is another huge loss.
Because it will be a huge loss, because he did I thought, an excellent job of showing what ifs, if you did this, this, or this, and what happened to shift the amount different towns were. It was a pretty clear end product, that he pushed through. So I just think having more than just one of us, I can't make the December 7th meeting, by the way, but I'm just saying that that's the key kickoff for this, yeah.
Dorothy?
Well, I think that Andy should go, but I think you should go with an additional person from the committee. You are the most experienced, and therefore we keep sending you and sending you and sending you, and we need to be getting some breadth. It's too bad Kathy can't come. I am not the right person, but I'm teaching in that morning anyway. So who is the right person? Oh, she's got her hand up right there.
Yeah. The other person who's very familiar with this, I would point out, is Mary Lou, who's her prior work with the Finance Committee of old, and her background on the school committee before that has provided a substantial role in this process and understanding of the process. Yes, Mary Lou.
I'm confused now about the December 7th meeting. Is that, as we have in the past, the people from all the towns, and yet I'm hearing something like there's another committee, an assessment committee in addition to that, that's going to meet as we did in the past, where we had 3 people from each town, which was the finance person, the school committee member, and somebody from the municipal. So that was a separate committee, and I think
That was
Andy and I.
appointed after.
Okay.
It was appointed after the Four Towns meeting, when the Four Towns meeting was clear that it was going to be a difficult problem, and then the committee was created. So it did not precede the first of the Four Town meetings. There's usually 2 a year. 2 Four-Town meetings a year. Yes.
Okay. And I think it's important to know that we had the consultant who looked at all of these things and mixed and matched them. And was it, 3 years ago, Andy, that his assessment for us, or told us, that the fairest formula was the per pupil cost rolling 5-year average. And we've gotten away from that. We can't agree with that. 3 of the towns can. So I hear what you're saying about a mediator. I'm not sure how that will work. We've had people who know, as Sean, who know all the finances, who know all of these variables, and we get stymied after every vote of town meeting. The next year, they want it different.
Yeah, I'm not sure that my recollection is the same, but I have to go back and look at my notes. I didn't think that he recommended that exactly. His recommendation was a weird formula, if I recall. So going on, let's get into the major topics, since that's why I'm here, and I also want to thank Nate Buddington from the Community Preservation Act Committee, and Holly Bowser, who's works downstairs in the Finance Department, and has been the staff representative working with CPAC, Community Preservation Act Committee, is really quite familiar with it, and has, between the two of them, have some information, because I think that we have to recognize, if you read the report, that if this were adopted, that the greatest expectation of funding, is, at least in dollar amount, probably does fall towards Community Preservation Act. And so I thought it would be helpful to have them present if there are questions. But what I'm really looking for from the committee is, as you've looked at it, what thoughts and questions you have, and then see if we can go from there into seeing if we have answers to some of the questions.
Just to clarify, this is exactly what we had before. It hasn't changed, even though we had given a number of suggestions for change.
They,
Yeah, go ahead. I think that's right.
The date's still 6/12/19.
My
Yeah.
sense is it hasn't changed, Mary Lou, that there's been a discussion in the CRC committee. There was a discussion at CPAC briefly. And this is, I think, the first time, at least since I've been here, that we would be reacting to the policy proposals here and really identifying things we want to either know more about or insert or change. Because this is, to me, it doesn't say exactly what should be done. It has some implications, but it has not been reworked.
No, but it does set a goal, or at least suggests a goal, which is out of a prior policy, that we would try and create 250 units of housing, and it's a little bit of vagueness as to whether we're talking about the number of years that is in there, whether it's 5 or 10 years, but whether it's 5 or 10 years, we probably, as a finance committee, ought to be thinking in terms of contributing to the discussion, not by delving into housing policy, but to delving into the cost and the financial consequences if we go forward with this. And Kathy?
Yeah, I actually wrote up a series both of questions, and I had some specific concepts that I wasn't sure whether the rest of the Finance Committee would agree with them or not, but how we would achieve the goal. But some of it is a fact-finding mission that I would really like to know what has been the total addition in the past 5 years for affordable units and how we count them. Just an updated count. And I've never been sure. I mean, we got an answer that it's the unit, so a studio apartment would count the same as a 3-bedroom unit, but I'd like some sense of, we got X units, and this was what we had before, and this is how much we've added in the last 5 years, because I want to have just sense of what does 250 look like if we look back 5 years. I don't think, number 2, I got an answer to this, but I don't think we count any units where CPAC has put up money that provides a rent subsidy that someone uses to help pay their rent in a rental unit that is not officially an affordable unit. So we're spending money that makes housing more affordable for some people, but not necessarily, it's not a huge number of people, but we do it through a housing subsidy. But I'd like just a sense of how many people that served. And then I'd like to have it be read. So I think this is a request for a larger study. What has been the total growth in housing stock in Amherst of the same 5-year period? We've added some big buildings, Kendrick, One East Pleasant, North Square. It's coming online, or what's going to be online. So, just if we're not even growing, are we growing by 500 units? What's the growth? I'd like to know that. What's the denominator as we do this? And then and we had a brief discussion of this just before we started. I'd like to know how much the town has invested over the last 5 years. And when I'm counting up where we've drawn our money, I may not have all of it, but we have the Community Development Block Grant that puts money into housing. CPAC has put money in every year. Tax incentives, we did $2.8 million over a 10-year period for the North Square, 26 units. And anything else we've done, the one other thing I know for sure we've done since I've been here is the town made a gift of a piece of land, the Skeet School, so that we could develop affordable units on that. So that has a concrete value to it. But I think we should start just tracking for our own knowledge what we've been investing, because we've been investing quite a bit, and both in the outcome side of units and then the housing stock side. So that's my, I've written these up and I can submit them, but I would like to have something come out of the council if we're going to move forward on a strategy to have some fact base before we embark on it. And then what I've been curious about, and I tried to go back and read the earlier housing documents, so housing production plans, we've got various titles, but in them they talked about changing our inclusionary zoning. Instead of the one Amherst has now is fairly complex, it only gets triggered by a special permit, and only under certain conditions does that trigger. Other entities, other municipalities have a more straightforward one that any development that's 10 or more X% are devoted to affordable housing that brings a developer's investment in it. And I'm not sure whether we've had a robust discussion about that in Amherst, so I'd like to talk about the why not do that. Are we in a position now where a lot of developers want to develop in Amherst, that it's not the drought that we had multiple years ago, because it brings in developer money in addition to town money. So I would just like to know where that policy, the pluses and minuses of it, and whether one report suggests it should be 15%, not 10%. Then the other thing that I've heard is that if a developer has affordable units, it's not that easy to figure out how each of these work. There are queues. Shalini had talked to me about this, that for the person who wants them, there's no central list of how many units are out there. I do one application form and I can get on the waiting list of multiple, help the developer figure out how these works. If we did a more streamlined process, where would it reside? How could we do that to make the red tape less daunting, both for the developer saying this is too much of a hassle, but also for the person? So I'd like to come back to, like, what's a package of things we could be doing besides taking pots of CPA money and saying, put it toward, and then CPA has done it in a variety of ways. It's been loans, it's been subsidies, it's leveraged some large state dollars. But I'd just like to see the list of our possible tools and what's not in our toolbox right now if we want to have a set of goals with some strategy on how we might realize those.
Yes, Shalini, and then you, Dorothy,
Yeah.
something too.
So clearly, I'm not an expert in housing, so I had to go out and look at what other towns are doing, and there is a website called Strong Towns, which some of you are familiar with, and they talked about ways that we can increase housing without the town spending money. So I was curious about strategies along those lines, and so they include, things like lowering the minimum lot size, allowing residential and commercial zones, permitting duplex and in single-family zones, speeding up our review process for the developers. And also there are many other strategies that do not involve the town money, and they could be used and implemented. So which ones of these have we used, and so what's working? And then going back to the incentives that we give, whether it's inclusionary zoning or there was a tax break that we give, how successful has that been? Like how many, I know that Beacon has utilized that, but not many developers, they find it too daunting, I think, to do the paperwork or whatever. So how can we improve the usability of those incentives?
Dorothy?
Well, I think I've been going to zoning board meetings, and accessible apartments, handicapped accessible apartments are included. And when asked why, the answer is because it's required. When asked, are there any affordable units, the answer is no, and the answer why is it's not required. And nobody is using our inclusionary zoning exception. Many, many special permits are given, but not the kind that triggers it. So I would say before I'd want to tie up all of our CPAC money for a long period of time, I would like the developers who seem to be quite interested in building in town now to share in the cost rather than have the town pay all of it or to use all of their state CPA money. So I think that Kathy is correct and Shalini is correct. Some of these things have been discussed at the planning board meeting, but not necessarily, they haven't been acted on. I think that maybe we, the council, will be the ones who act on it when we make some changes with them, I hope, on the zoning law. There is talk of lower lot sizes, of supplemental dwellings, which are ways of getting housing for more people. But there's also a lot of talk of things which I think are not realistic. I have a fear that we're talking about a large affordable housing unit downtown with the, I will have to say, fantasy that people don't need transportation anymore, and that is being quoted even in areas away from the center of town, that somehow we're going to all ride our bikes in the wintertime, which is just not true, and that we're going to have something that we don't want. And there's so many facts that are not being paid attention to. For example, when I was at Olympia Oaks the other day, an affordable housing unit, which I love, and I think is the kind of thing that we should do more of, one of the young men from Wayfinders was saying that, a couple that lives in an affordable housing can make $100,000 because $45,000 each. They can, and there's different exceptions, and it's a very complicated system, obviously. But those people will have a car. But I think that we're talking about a 40R overlay district, large, big thing, in order that this is part of that picture. And have a lot of building going on, and a University Drive and North Square, and the East Street will have affordable housing, but none of the others don't. We have to make changes. We have to make it so that this affordable housing is spread, and that we also don't put it all in one big spot, that we have integrated housing, that people are spread around. So I see a lot that makes me worried, quite worried, in this proposal, and I think there's lots of things that have to be changed, and unfortunately some of them are going to take time, like amending the zoning rules. But then we have to agree on what those rules will be, and that's going to take time.
Interesting discussion, and I will keep it going. Dorothy and I are both on the Community Resources Committee, which has also been discussing this. And my original thought had been that we would be talking about financial consequences of the policy, and that they would be talking about sort of housing policy issues in general. But I think that what we're hearing today is that the separation is a little bit more difficult.
And I think it's, when we talk about investing town dollars versus other methods, which Shalini started out on looking at lot sizes, and inclusionary zoning always is part of this, I don't want to lump putting tax incentives in as not using town dollars. I think when we give away $2.8 million through a tax incentive, that's spending town money. So just, I put them in two buckets, whether we spend it directly or indirectly, and then trying to weigh which long-term can we sustain, and what mix we might need, and it might change from year to year. But I don't think, I want to go back to, I don't think we have all the tools in our arsenal that we might have, and wasn't around for the earlier discussion, Andy, and I've got some of these Xeroxes that have the select board talking about modifying the exclusionary zoning to not have it just be triggered by a special permit. So I'm not sure where those discussions went, but as Dorothy said, we don't change our zoning laws very quickly or easily, but if this is potentially on the list, I think we should make a more holistic list of possible leverages that aren't just the CPAC money.
The town meeting, actually, the last town meeting did amend the inclusionary zoning requirement, and
Yes, but it still just works off a special permit.
we're tied to special permits, but it opened up the definition of special permits as opposed to having a very restricted definition.
And we haven't had one unit produced under that, not even one, because it's still, you can, as long as you're not more than 2 feet over. If you're 6 inches under the 2 feet, you don't do it. It's just we have a very restricted one compared to what other towns have and more complicated. I'm not saying.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I agree. But it hasn't been that much time, and it does take some period for the for proposals to come forward for consideration. I'm not sure how much has been proposed. I'd be interested in the Southeast Street one and how that's proceeding through the planning department, and I think that's something we have to talk to the planning department about probably, because that's the one that's new beyond, people keep talking about Spring Street, but we have to remember that Spring Street was applied for, it was in the pipeline, and therefore was not bound by the change in what happened at town meeting. Yes.
At the planning board, we heard some interesting stories that the plan, and you can comment on this to say whether this is correct, but at the planning board, it was said that what town meeting passed said that if a special permit was requested, that the inclusionary zoning was triggered, and that after that vote, the words for a special permit for change of need or change of use, that had not been in the vote that the town meeting took. So the language which was proposed as that we should think about at the planning board meeting was any and all special permits, that it would be triggered with application of any and or all special permits, and that it be 15% of space or units. And that is something which is done in many other towns, so it's not like it's being invented. And so we can, I think maybe Cambridge is the town that's quoted a lot.
But Cambridge doesn't use special permit, Dorothy. It's just an inclusionary zoning requirement, period. It's not triggered by a special permit. If you build a place, if you build more than 10 units, okay, that's what I'm saying. It's just, there's a difference. We have one that has to be triggered.
Yeah, the one thing that we have to be aware of, and we don't know, and this is again where you have to get back into talking to the people from the planning department to get a better understanding of this. And I'm going to actually, because I don't know how long Nate could stay, want to make sure we get to the Community Preservation Act part of the discussion fairly quickly. But if you do make a requirement, if it will affect the ability to construct, if developers will then stop coming, that's a judgment call that's difficult to make. I don't know how to make it, which is why I would really need to turn to experts. Yeah, Shalini.
I just had a question about, it says over here in the policy proposal that builders, the developers can pay into the housing trust in lieu of establishing affordable units. So I'm wondering if we're not seeing inclusionary zoning being used? Was it did the developers pay the fund instead of building the units? Do we know that?
I don't, I have
It
not
says
heard of
here,
any.
though.
I haven't
How
heard
it
anybody
seems-
mention putting money in it. I do know that the place that's being proposed for Southeast Street
Do we know?
has offered some amenities on the public way, some of his property and on some of the public way, in creating a more park-like atmosphere in front of the building, and that he built a bus stop. But, so in other words, that was some money that was spent that would be a benefit for more than just his units, but it wasn't what is in the zoning law about putting it into a fund.
So we'd really need to find out if there was any,
Well, it wasn't triggered. Actually,
Yeah.
it wasn't. That only happens if you ask for the special change of use thing. No one
Yeah.
asked for it.
Please use your mic.
Sorry.
This may actually trigger a little bit of the conversation about CPAC, but I look at this, and I also think about the fact that the council is getting ready to embark on our capital plan for our four major investments we need to make. And on November 18th, we'll receive for the first time the broad recommendations for the goals for climate action. Every one of those carries a huge price tag. And so I don't feel like we can look at this in a vacuum. I think we have to look at this in a sense of the whole of the finances of the town and think about it in a much bigger, broader sense. I also really, really like the questions that Kathy started with, and really feel like we need to know a lot more about what our housing stock looks like at this point and how that has evolved over 5 years, 10 years, whatever. I have no idea if these are realistic goals. I just have none. And then I'll let Nate speak. I mean,
Yeah.
two of us attended JCPC when they had this discussion, but Nate is chairing it.
JCPC or CPAC?
CPAC.
Okay, let me hear from Shalini, and then let's turn it to, turn the topic to CPAC. But go ahead,
Okay.
Shalini.
I was just going to add to what Lynn said about when we have this policy discussion around housing, we need to include maybe recommendations of housing location, construction, maintenance, what all of those factors that go into making the housing sustainable and so forth. And along with that, I was also looking up other things that would make a policy stronger with respect to housing, and they included a couple of points that I'm just going to quickly run through. So when we're talking about housing policy, even looking at the building standards and the safety factors, like, whether there's lead or what, does that get incorporated in a housing policy, the safety, the fire? I think someone spoke to that yesterday. So including those factors into the housing policy, and then the sustainability factors to be considered. And there was one other thing. To help policymakers should reduce barriers to housing supply. This was, okay, I can send the article to everyone just because when we're creating a housing policy, this was an article explaining what are some factors we should include to make it a robust policy.
No, it's helpful, but what it prompts me to think is that we really probably do need to do more to merge the discussion of this committee and CRC, because some of these issues are really getting out of the pure financial side, but they're related to the policy, and they're things that are in the CRC discussion. And I'll talk to the CRC chair tomorrow after the meeting of that committee, and see if we can, if I can just send all of you the draft of where they are, because they've actually done a compilation of issues and that touches on some of these. But I did want to while we have our two people from CRC here today, have an opportunity to hear about the discussion that happened at the Community Preservation Act Committee, and then a little bit of your thoughts about how housing initiatives reach the CPA committee, because they go from somebody to the CPA committee to either town meeting before us or the council, so that there's a flow that goes, and you've had an opportunity to see the flow. And this policy has to, in the end, come back to the realization that the council or the Community Preservation Act Committee can't create a proposal. It's got to come from someplace. So, do you have a minute? And I think also Holly has put together a few things about some of the past experiences, but hey, I guess first, you did have a discussion, as Lynn was saying, at the committee. How did that, where was that discussion?
We did. I'm Nate Buddington. I'm the chair of the CPA. I'm sorry? We did have we had a presentation by John Hornet regarding the proposal that I guess you have in front of you. And we didn't really have a chance as a committee to have a lengthy discussion about it. I think we will be doing that in our next meeting because, I mean, for a couple of reasons, it's something that we need to get real clarity on, both because it seems to indicate potentially a fairly big change in policy, and it also is, recommending that CPA get more involved in policy than we are now. So those are two things that obviously we need to have a more extended discussion about. I think since I've been on the committee, one of the slight disconnects in what we do with housing is we don't really have a sense of, in any given proposal that's given to us, the sort of the context, the bigger context of what town housing policy is. We're not sure there is a larger policy in housing, and it would be easier for us, I think, to vet proposals if we had more clarity on what the big picture long-term goal is for affordable housing in the town. We tend to get proposals usually from known entities, and we make decisions on them individually if they seem like they're well-designed and meeting the right constituency and financially sustainable. But it would be nice for us to have a much clearer sense of what the sort of overall overarching town policy is about affordable housing. The other topic, which is Mr. Hornick's interest in creating a committee of, I guess, what you call stakeholders, which would involve CPA representation in formulating policy. I think will potentially be a good discussion in the CPA. I think there may be some differences of opinion about that. But we haven't had that discussion yet. That's for probably our next meeting.
So, yes, Lynn.
So I just want to make sure that my assumption is correct. And that is that if there is a housing policy adopted for the town of Amherst, it's adopted by the council. And it is only with that adoption that it would ever then be used by any committee.
Well, that's my assumption.
I assumed it was, but
Yeah.
And I think getting CPAC's experience, because of the many housing proposals you vet every year, is huge, as well as, the Housing Authority and the Housing Trust, right, or any other committee that deals with housing. But this goes back to my bigger statement before of looking at this in the big picture.
Yeah,
I have a question, just conceptually, if there were a policy, okay, so whatever it might be, like we would like to achieve X, Y, and Z, have you thought through how CPA then might act differently? You know, so what you're saying is right now you kind of, the proposals come to you from wherever they come. You don't, I don't think you typically do like an RFP, we're looking for proposals in the following categories.
Right.
You know, so just, you know, could you, are you willing to kind of speculate on how that might change the way you operate?
Well, it's a good question, and there may be some differences that we couldn't predict. But, you know, we do entertain proposals from independent entities, like Amherst Community Connections would be one. They've received a couple of awards from us in the last couple of years. They've always seemed to be well-reasoned, well-supported systems of rental subsidies and that address a really, really vulnerable population in town, the homeless. But I have no sense of where Amherst Community Connections proposals fit within any kind of town policy. And so there's a little bit of flying by the seat of our pants when we approve those kind of proposals. I think they're good. I think, you know, I sleep well at night after awarding them money. But we could get more of those. And it's just, on the one hand, they're addressing a really vulnerable population that we're not getting proposals from any other entity to serve. But are they legit? Do they fit into an overarching town policy?
yeah, Dorothy and then Shalini.
An interesting discussion that came up just 2 days ago was about older houses in town, and one reason they're being turned into student rentals is because of the lead paint, which means that they're not suitable to be rented to families with children under, in New York City, I think it was under 6. In Amherst, it may be a higher age, I don't know. And so my husband was at this discussion, and you know, it's possible for towns or a place like CPA to give grants to homeowners to ameliorate the lead paint if, in fact, they were going to house some people who were within the affordable category, which I mentioned today earlier, is higher than you may think. It includes what we just call middle class, okay? It's includes most of us.
Right.
Shalini?
The point that Nate just made about community connections and serving the homeless was a question I had, that I did not see homeless population being addressed in the policy. Like, what is the town's goals, or, I don't know, with respect to the homeless people?
It's a good question. I think that was probably one that was on the CRC list too. But does the Community Preservation Act committees, we did adopt, I forgot, it was a plan, and it had section on housing. Was there enough was there any guidance in it that you adopted as a committee that helped you in vetting these proposals?
Well, the plan is a couple of years old, and we're rewriting it right now. And we're in the process of rewriting it, and some of the housing, the section on housing is one of the sections that will get a rewrite. I'm not sure it really gives us that much guidance. You know, I think, you know, when a couple of years ago in our discussions about housing were mostly about lower income and about homeless, and I think lately there's been some discussion about people that teach in the public schools here, people that work in town who are not lower income, but they really struggle to live in Amherst. That hasn't really been a part of our discussion and we haven't really started discussing it, but that's beginning to be something that we'll be thinking about. There's really nothing in the current plan The plan, the formal name of the document is what you're referring to, I assume, the Community Preservation Act plan. There's really nothing in there that addresses that constituency, so.
And of course, as I recall when it was originally written, that they were looking to other committees in town to contribute to the sections. So it would be natural to meld whatever comes out of this whole process into it. Have there been any, I know there have been some years where we've had more housing proposals than we've been able to fund, because I can remember some of those discussions.
Yes, but I think I'm just trying to think about the last couple of years. I think the ones that we have not funded, we felt okay about not funding. I know I think last year we had one that was for a home purchase program, but it did not guarantee in perpetuity that home be reserved for low-income family. So we didn't approve that one. I don't know, can you think, anything you can recall in the last couple of years that?
Not right off the top of my head, but there are a few comments that I can somewhat respond to. And I think that Andy's correct in reminding us that we can't bring something to CPA. Somebody has to bring a proposal to us. We never know what they're going to bring to us. The rent subsidy programs, the ones through ACC, were very new to us. We were a little leery of them. We gave them a try. They've worked out great. I think that our CPA plan is somewhat vague because we don't know what people are going to bring to us, and we don't want to tie our hands to say we're only going to accept this, this, and this type of proposal, and then somebody comes out with something new and innovative, and it's not in our plan, and we can't say yes at that point. If this housing production plan or this plan that the Amherst Municipal Affordable Housing Trust is bringing to us is too specific, and it would tie our hands with some new things that may come down the road, I think we would be a little bit leery of that.
Yeah.
That's sort of how I feel about it. And I do want to just comment on what I believe Shalini had said about the Amherst Community Connections and those rent subsidy programs. Those are not permanently affordable. Those are temporary, so those don't get added to any sort of affordable units production plans. Those are just temporary subsidies. So those,
She negotiates with the landlords for those individual.
yes, and those units change.
Units.
So those 3 units could be here this year, and next year she may get a better deal somewhere else, and those units could be elsewhere. So those units are not going to be included anywhere there. The information that Nate Malloy and the Planning Department had done a couple years ago that I believe you all got in front of you is really great. It does show that we've done a lot. We really have done quite a bit. There are a few things that have happened since then that are not in this. He can update this. He just did not have time to get that done before this meeting. And there's just a couple that I think in the last couple of years have been approved, just to give you a little more information. There was another first-time homebuyers program, I believe, a couple years ago, which it was 4 or 5
This is the one by the farm.
mortgage the mortgage subsidies where they give subsidies towards the mortgage. There was the Amherst Community Land Trust, 2 single-family homes that would be low income, where they were going to purchase the land underneath, and then they purchased the home. So those were some affordable units that were added as well. And in regards to the North Square, there's a few numbers out there between 2.6 and 2.8 million. I think until those 10 years have gone by and we know exactly what it is, it's all just sort of an estimate at this point, somewhere between 2.6 and 2.8 million over 10 years. They get a bigger break in the beginning, and then the break slowly goes away until they're paying full price after the 10 years. And that was the 26 units. I also, Andy had asked about Rolling Green. I do have some information on Rolling Green. That was our biggest one to date, I would say. That was 42 units that, for $1.25 million bonded over 10 years. I have the information on that, on exactly what that cost us, if people are interested in that. And again, just to reiterate what Nate said is, we really haven't had much of a discussion at all about this. Mr. Hornet came in, he gave us a presentation. We're just getting ready to accept our proposals in the next 6 weeks or so. They'll be rolling in, and I don't think we're going to have enough time to really decide and discuss that before this round. It's really going to probably be something that would be for the next round, for FY22, before we can make any real, have enough discussion and make any real decisions on what we're going to do there. But once again, I don't think that we would want to tie our hands to specific amounts or specific types of proposals, because then we could lose somebody coming in with something we just never thought of before.
Yeah, Mary Lou?
I was curious about the affordable housing for public service and teachers. I'm assuming that a study would be done polling our teachers and our public safety people before we do anything in that area. I mean, there may be other reasons they aren't living in Amherst.
Lynn?
I'm one of the people that's been pushing the issue of workforce housing. And it's not just our public employees, it's the people at the university who are not in tenure-track professor positions, et cetera. I mean, there's any number of people who work in this town who are, making whatever income we want to talk about, but they would not be considered low-income housing. They would be considered workforce housing. And it's a group of people that are often young, are often going to start their families and would like to send them to good schools like Amherst. And basically what my observation is from what I've seen in town is we're seeing a bifurcation. It's the people who can afford expensive houses, and then it's students, and then it's low income. And we're missing that center core of workforce housing, and therefore that center core of that age group, and that part of that group that becomes very vital to a population and its growth.
Just in terms of CPA, are you limited, so when I think of there's the 80% or below of AMI, but then there's this space between 80 and 100%, that's where you can come in with units and have them be called affordable, is that correct? I mean, that starts to get into what I call the bottom of the middle class or the top of the lower income. They're not dirt poor, but they can't. So that's where you can fund units that go into that bracket and get it counted toward our stock. Is that correct?
Are we limited to that?
Or not?
I
So
don't-
just
never-
if you were funding these, would they count? When we're this magic 10% threshold that we have to stay above?
Well, I don't think that's a requirement of proposals that they meet, that they fall into that percentage. I don't think
Okay.
that's, it would obviously be preferable, but that, we're not restricted by that.
Yeah. Rob?
Yeah, I think as part of our deliberations or our investigations into this, we also need to look at the price of land in Amherst. I mean, the price of a building lot in Amherst is so high now that you're not going to get anything other than a very expensive house put on there, just because the economics of it are such. I lived in the Washington, D.C. area for a while, and there would be, we had a very small house and a very small lot, and yet the lot was actually worth more than the house. And there were a lot of places where they would come in, buy the thing, knock the little house down, and put a big house on the same lot and sell it for a lot more money. So we're not going to get very far if the price of land or the price of taking a smaller house and making it a little bit bigger versus knocking it down and making it a lot bigger, that's going to be a real problem in terms of especially workforce housing, where you're not really going to be living in multifamily units probably. So I think we need to consider that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it takes us a little bit away from the CPA discussion for a second, and it does get to something that Chalany had been bringing up important also about cutting required lot size, which probably is a discussion that should have happened 20 years ago.
But I also wonder, I agree on the lot size and cost in Amherst. If you live just over the border of Amherst in Pelham, Shutesbury, Leverett, Granby, it's not going to be that much longer commute to work than if you live in North Amherst and you're going to South Amherst. So, so I don't know how we take into account to what extent the families that can't buy the house in town can buy a house, within a 20-minute commute. And Dorothy is talking about, transportation. I mean, once you're not downtown, you're car dependent no matter where you are. You're car dependent up in North Amherst. The bus doesn't go there. So I don't know how we think of our stock, but having someone, the regional school district, they'll get picked up by the middle school area. They'll be in a separate elementary school, depending on which town they're in. But I think we shouldn't be thinking just as if you're not literally in the 7 square miles that are called Amherst. We've moved you to the 3-hour commute from somewhere. So, and I don't know how we assess that, on, how far away are people who are working here every day commuting, and how long is that? I don't have any sense of that.
There are actually databases that allow you to look at those kinds of issues. They're built off the census as part of it, but then there's many other databases. I want to go back to something that Dorothy made as a point, and that is just this past weekend, a couple of us were in a couple of the different housing clusters. And even something like Olympia Oaks, but built for middle income or workforce housing, the sense of community in those housing areas is just phenomenal. I mean, it defies any kind of community that I can name in any other part of Amherst, except for the point in time where they had to have 2 school buses for one street in Amherst Woods when they first opened Amherst Woods. Then it was a sense of community. But so going back to lot size, not necessarily, I grew up in a row home. It wasn't a big lot size, and we had one side of the house was attached to a next house. So there was nothing wrong with that. And that's what I'm thinking when I think of looking at lot size and looking at housing and building communities. And then I think one of the sources of data, by the way, is the number of kids whose families pay for them to come to the Amherst schools, even though they don't live here. And that actually has increased based on a report the superintendent gave us, I think, a year ago.
Yes, go ahead.
Another question that comes to mind as I'm reading this article is that how much subsidies are we offering to renters versus homeowners? Because it seems nationally homeowners are subsidized more through giving them deductions in their taxes and stuff. So there are figures like $120 billion worth of subsidies are given to homeowners, whereas only $40 billion to low-income renters. So do we have a sense within Amherst how much of the subsidies are being offered to renters versus homeowners?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer, so that's why I pause. Go ahead.
I don't have an answer for Amherst, but on your taxes in Massachusetts, you can show a $2,000 amount that you use for rent. Now, how much that takes off of your taxes themselves, I don't know. But there is a place on the Massachusetts form, if you are a renter, you can declare $2,000 of your rent.
I just meant in terms of the subsidies with respect to our housing. I mean, that definitely is a tax benefit that's there. But with respect to housing support and subsidies, how much are we supporting homeowners and how much low-income renters? That would be good to know.
Some of these are questions that we need to try and assemble now and work with the Community Resources Committee and then ultimately the Planning Department to see if we can find some answers to them, because we're really delving straight into that borderline that's getting us into housing policy question. I think that the one thing that we've really come down to is a practical matter, and I want to go back to CPA directly, aside from the fact that CPA is not going to be creating housing, and if we're going to have a policy that is about creating housing and is going to have an active town role, then there has to be somebody within the staff or a committee that is going to work with groups like Wayfinders or work with groups, work with private developers to create housing proposals that will include affordable units in whole or in part. And then that initiative can possibly lead to looking to CPA for support for part of the cost. But the creation has got to cut. If there's going to be a policy that says we have a goal to create, something's got to create. And otherwise, I think that what our experience has been, and these guys who've been dealing with CPA intensely for a long time, I think can say more if they wish, but probably don't need to, that the proposals that have come are that have been most successful are opportunities that came to us and we said, wow, that's a great opportunity, let's fund that.
That's right.
And that's created some things. And the biggest one that we've had with Rolling Green was actually not creating any new units, was preserving units, because there was the thing with Rolling Green is that it was going to be sold for totally market rate housing, and they were going to lose all of their affordable units, and that got an effort to get together, and I think that the town did actively work to find Beacon, and Beacon came in and made a proposal, and it was a wonderful combination of circumstances, but that enabled Beacon to buy with town partnership and preserve those units, and but it didn't create units, and that was just happenstance. Yeah, Lynn?
So while we've been sitting here, and because somebody mentioned something about a plan for CPA, so I went to the CPA part of the town website, and in there is a March 2013 housing production plan. When is the last time we've looked at that? How does this proposal fit into that? And how should that plan be looked at from a standpoint of this conversation we're having here, both about the present proposal and the whole issue of workforce housing?
Well, housing production plan is mentioned in the
In here.
draft.
Yeah.
And is that something, do you ever look at the housing production plan as part of your review process?
No, we used it in I think 2017 when we did a pretty substantial rewrite of the plan. We use that as sort of the base for what we put in there about housing. But that was, we were broken up into subcommittees, so the entire committee did not see the 2013 housing production plan. We saw what was excerpted from it and used in the CPA plan from 2017.
In the bottom of page 1 of the proposed housing policy from the Affordable Housing Trust, it says the housing production plan included the most information on estimated unmet needs and specifically called for 250 units of affordable housing over a 5-year period. So they cited that, and actually I think that was the basis of the 250 number that they've used in it. There was a prior statement that mentioned the master plan, the housing production plan, and the comprehensive housing market study, and said each report was formally adopted by the select board. I'm not sure I agree with that sentence, by the way. I just wanted to point that out as a former member of the former select board.
So if this was in our housing production plan, and it's now almost, used 2015, it's 5 years later, how have we progressed towards achieving that goal? I think the issue of setting these goals is based on going back to the very original statement, where we stand on in the last 5 years. What have we done? What have we accomplished?
Somebody would have to go through and count them up, and I'm not going to do that now.
No.
But it's I think that that's what Nate's work was in part trying to do, is to create that history. Yeah, Dorothy?
I have a question. If there's meetings, housing meetings all over the place, and many of them have to do with 40R. Let's say a 40R proposal comes our way for 100 to 200 unit affordable housing. Okay. How much of money, CPA money, how does CPA money work with that, and for how long?
Well, we have, usually around $1 million to spend. We can borrow money, as we did with, I think, Rolling Ridge was, how much?
Rolling Green.
I was going to say $1.5 million, but 1.2. So we would be able to do that again if we felt, because I think we operate pretty conservatively about borrowing, but I think if we felt
But the question is it one time, or is it something that's going to tie up the CPA money over many years? That's the question.
Well, we haven't done that since I've been on the committee. I don't know if they've done that in sort of a 5-year plan of $500,000 a year for 5 years, or whatever, $200,000 a year. We've never done that.
What do you have in?
Well, in effect, if you've leveraged by going out with a large bond, you've tied up part of next year's money.
Yeah.
So you are making a multi-year, when you're doing that,
Right.
you are, as opposed to saying each year we'll do this. But, I guess my sense is it completely depends on what the nature of the components are, because some of when Northampton did their 40R, some of it was state matching grants for specific projects. It can be a whole mix. It's not a thing. So coming.
How long would they be tied up? That's the question.
But if they went out for $1.5 million, they tied up a lot of money for several years to pay back that loan.
That's right.
So if I may, my comment was going to be exactly that, is, again, until something come before us and until we had a dollar amount, then we would figure out how we could fund it, if we could fund it within a current year's budget, or if we would have to fund it through borrowing. We can make recommendations on how long we'd like to borrow, but the ultimate borrowing authority is with the treasurer. So 5 years, 10 years, however long, we could go out for that. And I just lost my train of thought. I was going to say, so through the CPA, each year, we have to commit 10% to affordable housing of our estimated available funds. 10% has to go to affordable housing, 10% has to go to open space, and 10% has to go to historic preservation. We've not had a problem meeting that 10% most years. It's usually just a little over $100,000 of our available funds, anywhere from $100,000 to $150,000. We have one proposal that can meet that minimum. We do have the ability to, even if we already met our minimum, we do have the ability to put money into a reserved for a specific piece of CPA. So we have reserved in the past money for affordable housing just because we had money left over, or we didn't want to spend it in a different category. We wanted it to go towards affordable housing. We banked it for a couple of years and then used it towards affordable housing in subsequent years when we had more proposals than we had for available funds. But through CPA, the minimum is 10% a year that has to be designated to affordable housing. If for some reason we didn't have those proposals come in, we would have to set it aside. But that's the only requirement by law. We could spend 80% of it on affordable housing and just 10 on historic and 10 on open space. But again, it depends on what comes in, what that mix is, and what we seem to be the most worthy at that time, I guess you would say,
Okay.
if that helps.
No, that does help a lot, and I think it was something that I was going to get back to because I want to conclude the discussion, and I thought that was one thing that was out there. It actually would be helpful to know because, as you said, it's 10% minimum for each of three categories, and there's a fourth category that doesn't have a minimum, which is recreation, and we have gone over, obviously, because we're doing more than, we're giving out the money. And it seems to me, but this is impressionistic, not based upon any study, that over the years that we've probably done more for housing than for anything else. And so it'd be interesting to quantify what it is that we've spent in CPA funds for each of the things we know about. The other comment that I wanted to make for this committee is that in the end, we're talking about financial consequences. We ought to be thinking about what are the other demands that are out there, and one is recreation. That there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the state of our recreation land amount and the quality of the current facilities, and I think that it's quite likely that we're going to be seeing significant requests for recreation space, either acquisition or just maintenance. And that if that comes along, that's going to be, if you will, that there's 80% that's not committed to two categories that could go to housing, but you can't, we're not going to go there because unless we say we're absolutely doing nothing else, we're hitting the bare minimum on the two other required pots, and we're not going to do anything for recreation. And is that a realistic statement to make? I think we all know the answer to that question. And we wouldn't expect the committee to want to do that either.
And yeah, just, I want to just build on that because one of the things I heard on the last round of housing when some of these issues were more contentious around one particular project, some of the residents were concerned that their tax dollars through the CPA tax dollar side weren't always benefiting the same working population that Lynn was talking about, and to the extent the playing fields at the high school or the state of the Mill River recreation areas weren't being maintained. They saw it as, not a balanced approach. So I think that is a really important, the mix. It's not just housing for people who might want to move into Amherst, but the quality of life for people who are living here who feel like they're putting up the money. So I realize that you do this balance all the time, but it was brought home to people more with where did that money come from? Who? What else could it be used for? It brought a lot of attention to the pot of money that is the Community Preservation Act funds.
And I think we have been pretty balanced. And part of that is I think we've gone into the deliberations with a desire to be balanced between the four areas. But we've also, we get good proposals from all four areas. It makes that easier. Was it around these discussions you heard, were they based around the proposal on Route 9, the housing proposal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just for the local residents, who were
Right.
directly affected. People were always saying, oh, we're putting money into people who might want to move into town, but what about some of us who are living here, we're putting our tax dollars to use to work for us also.
Well, I think if they looked through what we've done in the last couple of years, they would see
Yeah.
some pretty impressive projects that meet a broad swath of the population in town.
Yeah, Lynn?
The other place that we sometimes fund housing out of is the CDBG money. It's not been a lot, but we have occasionally done some housing kinds of things there.
And that's quantified in the thing that Mr. Malloy sent to us. So what I think that we're going to need to do now is probably, this has been a really helpful discussion, but I think what I was thinking is this, that I probably need to get Kathy's questions and work with Kathy since she reviews the minutes.
Okay. And I've added a couple that Shalini raised too.
And I was going to ask everybody else to send in questions that think should be added to the extent possible, focus on financial issues. But if you can't, if it blends out, it's still a valid question. Don't leave it off the list, but as you're trying to focus it. And let's see if we can come up with a summary of the questions that we've identified and issues that we've identified, and also then go from there into sort of compiling with Community Resources Committee, and I will ask tomorrow if I can send that current draft of that to you so that everybody has a chance to see what they've done on this, and put forward that yes, if there's going to be a housing policy, it's got to address these problems, and I think that that's really the feedback we're giving. We're not saying that we shouldn't have a housing policy. There's already been statements saying a housing policy would be helpful, but I think that we need to sort of frame what we think are the constraints on the housing policy, because the feeling that I'm getting is that the draft that's been put forward to us is kind of broad and vague. And it isn't really a policy, therefore there could be something that we really, doesn't have a plan of implementation, and it doesn't have the anything that will get us to specificity that will get us to any additional housing. But we also, I think, recognize the financial strain that's going to be on anything we do. As Lynn said earlier, we know that ECAC is going to have requests, and there's going to be many other things that are out there of things that are expected from this community that are beyond what we can do. And ultimately, as Finance Committee, we've got to bring all of this together and say, so what do we suggest is affordable?
Right.
Does that sound like a plan? Mm-hmm. Anything else, Mary Lou?
Just a question. The last time we talked about this, it dealt with some formatting, and that this policy, I know this is not our job, but is this going to go forward to one of your committees that if you are going to come up with a policy, we'll have the format of a policy so that it's not this? Okay, I just really wanted to be clear about that.
Do we have an answer to that? I don't know.
I'm just nodding my head because to me, this doesn't look yet like a policy. So I think we would start with some sort of background statement with a history of what we've done, with what we're trying to do, and what leverage, I have it sort of organized in my mind in a more sub pieces, but I noticed the CRC minutes, which I've been reading, or their report, they're thinking along those lines too, what are the pieces and how to organize it, so.
Okay.
I have a question. I'm just looking through the Nate's inventory, which I had missed. When we document our own spending, do we keep notes on this spending leveraged another $3 million of state money? I mean, is there a tracking of it's our money plus other money versus just our money?
Well, one of the things that we do in our deliberations is, we're very explicit about this in the plan, is we're biased in favor of proposals that bring grants, where we're matching. And sometimes takes, in town proposals where there's a potential for a future grant, we will be asked to provide the initial funding, which then the grantee will use in their deliberations to give the grant. So sometimes that money gets returned to us if the grant is rejected. Is that?
So
Yeah, that's answering the question, and then
I can help to maybe clarify that a little bit. If it's a grant that the town receives for a purchase of a property that is going to go with CPA, yes, we absolutely track that because it's our money and our grant. But if it's a grant that, say, the Emily Dickinson House gets that's going to be combined with the CPA money, we don't track their funds and their grants and anything that the other entities would have received. But if it was an open space property that the town was purchasing and the town applied for a grant, we would have that information in our financials. But other entities, it's not as easy to track on our books, if that answers.
I was particularly thinking of the Route 9 project down the road. If that goes all the way to fruition, we put in an amount of money, but we potentially are leveraging a really big pot of money, and just having a ledger that says, well, we put in this, but it brought in another, it's not a grant, it's a grant in a different way. So just try, I don't know how many of these on Nate's list had that or not. I don't know the history of all of them, yeah. Okay.
I would say we're not very good at that piece of it. If it's our grants and funds that we're receiving, then definitely. But when it's other entities, those things, I don't think we track in our books very well.
In the CPA report, if that is known that this will leverage this amount of additional dollars, even if it doesn't go to us, I find that frequently in the CPA report, because
Absolutely.
Should always be in the report.
Absolutely, but they're not things that we have like a
We don't.
database of, that it's all together. It would be in each year's CPA report that this was adding to these funds, or this was adding to those funds that they got, but it wouldn't be in one central location that I'm aware of. Let me just put it that way. I'm not aware of that.
so it would require somebody to do some research on each project.
A really good graduate student project.
Yeah, because you look at a lot of these that are on Nate's list, and some list additional money, some don't. But Olympia Oaks must have had some additional money coming in, and the amount that he's showing is the town contribution, not the total construction cost. And his calculation always at the end is the town cost per affordable unit, so that ultimately it was the total for that one of CPA and CDBG money divided by the number of units. But it really isn't the cost per unit, that's the town funds per unit. So we probably should recognize that there's a gap in information available to really assess this. And I'll be interested in hearing how your discussion goes. Do you have a date for your next meeting where you're going to talk about it, or is that to be determined?
We're aiming for the 29th, but we're having a hard time getting a full quorum, so, but tentatively the 29th. I have to decide tomorrow.
This per unit thing that's been brought up a number of times, I think we really need to know how many people or how many bedrooms.
That may be hard to do. That's something that, again, we'd have to ask the planning department about. You certainly don't know the number of people that are living in each building because you don't know how many people per bedroom anyway.
They're generally rules.
Well, you can make
New York City had
assumptions.
rules as to, you couldn't actually have mixed siblings of opposite sex in the same bedroom. I mean, they're rules.
They do.
Yeah, you want to assure me that New York City was enforcing those rules?
They were when it suited them, and they did. When
When
wanted
it
to get
suited
into-
them.
When you wanted to get into a building, you had to prove that you could figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, we've had similar rules here about number of unrelated people who could live in a unit, and it was never clearly enforceable, either as a matter of practicality or as a matter of law. So is there anything else to be said? Is there anything else that you'd like to offer? We really appreciate your participation. If not, I'll do my best to see if I can get to your meeting if you're going to have one, just so I can hear your discussion.
I think the discussion about how, whether we're going to formalize CPA's role in policymaking will be a pretty lively discussion on the committee. That's my guess. And I hope we'll come to some agreement on that on the 29th. But it may take a little bit longer.
So, anything else from the committee that the committee wants to raise on this or another topic? Because if not, I think we can.
The only one we had listed on the list was the way we do minutes. It's a purely procedural. I mean, this is not a substantive thing for you all. So I just wanted to review what we have an excellent minute taker here, the way we've been doing it to make sure that everyone's still comfortable with it. If that's okay, Andy, so I don't know what else is on your list.
Oh, yeah, there was one other thing I was going to
Okay,
do
so-
real quick, but go ahead.
Okay, so just on minutes, we now have Megan, who is taking minutes for us, and what we had been rotating the responsibility for minutes among ourselves, and I volunteered because I guess I'm just a glutton for punishment, to be a reviewer of the minutes so that we would have one person saying if they needed to, they go back, watch the tape. So I've been reviewing and finalizing them rather than bringing them to the committee to read and individually comment. So I want to make sure people are comfortable with that. We have been posting the minutes, and we have a videotape, particularly because Mary Lou and Bob weren't here when we did that, but we literally are doing the simplified, someone writes them, Kathy reads them. If she doesn't think it quite captured everything, I go and watch the tape and amend it, or we could go back to, we all see a draft of the minutes, and we get a chance to read them, and we spend some time in the committee with them.
I think your plan sounds good.
So grateful.
Yes.
So we read these online, we don't get a copy.
Well,
Or
we
not
were going
email
to
the
change
copy?
that to make sure that copies get sent out because we realize that that's a gap that's been in
So-
existence.
So we've been, in theory, uploading them every time, but I think there's been a glitch in having that happen, Mary Lou. So we have an internal thing called SharePoint where people could see it on the committee, but they have the clerk of the town council is helping us post all those minutes. So I just caught up today with all the minutes up until last meeting. So we should be able to get them all up. And what I can do is, once they're finalized, just send a copy to everybody. Just so that you don't have to go look for them. But, now that we've got an expanded group, I was just uploading them to this cloud kind of thing, but I can just copy people on them.
But the public will be able to read them when the public looks at the meeting and it says agenda and it says minutes. They can click on and see the minutes if they want to, just anybody in the public.
That's supposed to be, it has supposed to have been happening and will happen, and then we're also going to try to do a more systematic way of, to the extent there are packets. One of the issues have been that we get a chart presentation, but we didn't actually ever get sent the chart presentation. People just come and do it, but trying to get that and then post it along with the meeting.
So I think we don't need to cover. The other thing I was just going to quickly mention is that I've had 2 requests for future agenda items. These are not attached to a specific date. I wanted to just let you know that I had these 2 requests and will be putting them on an agenda at an appropriate time, and to invite all members of the committee to send me suggestions about topics that you would like to add to the future list. The 2 that I have, one is that we talk about the subject of pilots payments in lieu of taxation payments from the university, colleges, and other tax-exempt charitable owners of property. That's one. And the second one is that we get an explanation of how water and sewer rates are set before the FY21 rates are presented to the council, so that we have a full understanding.
And I just wanted to do on the water rates, make sure we, when Sonia is back, we get verified so we can put into the public record the projection if we do the $11 million project, what will happen. Because that's out 10 years, but a best guess. So we're not just doing this coming year, but we're looking into the future. So I just want to expand that, Andy, to just make sure that doesn't slip in terms of, it's not immediate, but we should just get a good spreadsheet explaining how we figured out our best guesses of those.
That was actually, we can be more specific. I had intended that to be a part of it, but I was just doing a shorthand version. So if there are other issues, Lynn?
I'd like to just check on when our next meeting is, and then also mention that on the 7th at 6 o'clock, we are doing what is still called the 4 boards meeting, but the boards are defined differently. However, we hope that the Finance Committee members that are resident members will also join us that night. And the plan is that at 6 we will do, we'll receive a little bit of the kind of forecast we've received in the past regarding the finances. I believe after that, we are going to actually hold our required public forum that we have to hold every year before March 15th. But this one is really for people to say, gee, I hope in this budget you will see this. We did it last year on literally March 15th, and by then the budget's already cooked. So the time to have that conversation is now. It's November 7th, and it's at 6 o'clock, and Andy and I are literally going to discuss briefly whether we think we can fit it into this room after we're done with this meeting.
As far as the next meeting is concerned, I'm glad you brought up that topic, because we had said that we would meet on the Tuesdays following council meetings. The council meeting agenda has gotten somewhat jumbled from where it was originally. The next council meeting is actually on the 28th.
we're not having an official council meeting.
That's
What
right.
we're having on the 28th is the master plan primer and the master plan forum.
And we are not meeting on the 4th because
mean-
that's the day before
right.
the election. We're not meeting on the 11th as a council because it's Veterans Day, which then gets us around to, the next council meeting is now not scheduled until November 18. That's an awful long time if we're going to handle these issues. And if we go ahead and pick the date that's alternating week between the 4-week span, we would tentatively hold, if people are agreeable, Election Day for a meeting. I sort of hesitate to have meetings on Election Day.
Yeah, I'd had it penciled in as a finance meeting on November 5th, that's what you're talking
Yes.
about, yeah.
Okay, so why don't we leave it as it's on my schedule too, actually. And so let's leave it at that, even though there's no formal council meeting on the prior day.
So then we go from the 5th to the 19th, is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
We have officially changed our start time to 2:30, right, throughout the fall?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Okay. Anything else? I'm looking around because I'm just going to declare us adjourned, not bother with motion. I don't think we need one. By agreement, the committee is adjourned at 20 minutes after 4. I want to thank Amherst Media for being here. I want to thank our note taker, thank you, and Holly for being present and providing support, and all of the members of the committee.